October 12, 1944. The Vosges Mountains of northeastern France stood like silent sentinels, their steep ridges cloaked in dense pine forest that swallowed sound and light. Autumn rain hammered against the muddy slopes, turning every trail into a treacherous river of brown sludge. Somewhere in that cold, merciless wilderness, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, was being torn apart. They called it the Gothic Line's western extension. The Germans called it a fortress. The Americans called it hell. Private First Class Sadao Munmori crouched behind a shattered oak tree, his rifle clutched against his chest, breath coming in ragged clouds. Water dripped from his helmet, ran down his neck, soaked through layers of wool and canvas until his skin felt raw. Around him, the sounds of war created a symphony of terror, the distant thunder of artillery, the sharp crack of Mauser rifles, the screams of wounded men echoing through fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. He was 22 years old. 5 feet 6 inches tall. 140 pounds soaking wet. Back in basic training, they'd laughed at him. The drill sergeants, the other recruits, even some of his fellow Nisei soldiers had questioned whether this skinny kid from Los Angeles had any business carrying a rifle. Too weak, they'd said. Too small. One sergeant had actually pulled him aside and suggested he transfer to a support role, cooking, maybe, or supply logistics. Something where his size wouldn't matter. Sadao had refused. Politely, respectfully, but absolutely. Because Sadao Munmori understood something those men didn't. Strength wasn't measured in pounds of muscle or inches of height. Strength was what you carried in your chest when everything else had been stripped away, when your family was locked behind barbed wire in an internment camp in Arizona, when your own country looked at your face and saw an enemy, when you volunteered to fight for a nation that had taken everything from you except your name. That kind of strength didn't show up on a physical exam. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Wilson's voice cut through the static, tense and urgent. All units, hold position. Jerry's got the high ground. I repeat, hold position and wait for. The transmission exploded into white noise as a German shell screamed overhead and detonated somewhere behind their line. The concussion wave slammed into Sadao's back, throwing him forward into the mud. His ears rang. The world tilted sideways. When he looked up, he saw Corporal Tanaka lying face down 20 feet away, not moving. Medic, someone screamed. We need a medic. But the medics were pinned down too. Everyone was pinned down. The Germans had them completely surrounded on 3 sides, dug into positions that had taken months to fortify. Machine gun nests. Mortar pits. Sniper positions carved into rock faces that provided perfect killing fields. The 442nd had walked straight into a trap, and now they were paying for it in blood. Sadao crawled forward on his belly, ignoring the cold mud that filled his mouth and nose. He reached Tanaka and rolled him over. The corporal's eyes were open, staring at nothing. There was no wound that Sadao could see, but he knew what blast pressure could do to a man's insides. He closed Tanaka's eyes with shaking fingers. That made 3 men from his squad dead in 2 hours. The offensive had started 10 days ago, October 2, 1944, when the 442nd received orders to break through German defenses in the Vosges and open a path for the Allied advance into Germany. Intelligence said the Germans were weak here, demoralized, ready to fold. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. The Wehrmacht units defending these mountains were anything but weak. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal combat against the Soviets. They knew every trail, every ridge, every position where they could rain death on American troops. And they had no intention of retreating. Sadao's squad, what was left of it, had been tasked with clearing a section of forest nicknamed the Dark Mile, a stretch of terrain where the trees grew so thick that daylight never fully penetrated. The Germans loved the Dark Mile. They'd seeded it with mines, strung wire between the trees at neck height, and positioned snipers in elevated hides that gave them perfect sight lines down every approach. Moving through it was suicide. Not moving through it meant abandoning the battalion's mission. Sergeant Hayashi appeared beside Sadao like a ghost, his face streaked with mud and something darker. Munmori, he hissed, we're pulling back to the rally point. Pass the word down the line. What about Tanaka? What about? Leave him. Hayashi's voice cracked slightly. We'll come back for the bodies when we can. Right now, we need to move before Jerry brings down more arty. Sadao wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed at him to grab Tanaka's body, to drag him back, to not leave anyone behind. But training overruled instinct. He nodded once and began low-crawling to the next position, where Private Kimura was frantically trying to dig a deeper hole with his bare hands. "We're pulling back," Sadao whispered. Kimura's face showed pure relief. "Thank God. I thought." The sentence ended in a wet cough as a bullet punched through his throat. Sadao didn't think. His body moved on pure reflex, rolling sideways as more rounds chewed up the ground where he'd been lying. He caught a glimpse of muzzle flash from an elevated position maybe 70 yards away, a sniper, well camouflaged, firing from a platform built into the branches of a massive pine. His hands found his rifle. Brought it up. Sighted through the rain and fog at a target he could barely see. The sniper fired again, and bark exploded from the tree 6 inches from Sadao's head. Sadao exhaled slowly. Squeezed the trigger. The M1 Garand kicked against his shoulder. The sniper's body tumbled from the platform, crashing through branches before hitting the ground with a sound Sadao would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. 1. Move. Sergeant Hayashi was screaming now, all attempts at tactical silence abandoned. Everybody move now. The retreat turned into a chaotic scramble. Men abandoning positions, sprinting through mud and undergrowth while German machine guns opened up from multiple directions. Sadao ran with them, his undersized frame somehow weaving between trees that larger men crashed into. Behind them, the forest erupted with explosions as the Germans dropped mortar rounds to cut off their escape. They made it back to the rally point, a depression in the ground that offered minimal cover but at least gave them a moment to breathe. Sadao collapsed against a fallen log, gasping, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. Around him, the remnants of his squad and 3 others did the same. Out of 42 men who'd started the patrol, 19 had made it back. Lieutenant Wilson appeared, his face gray with shock. "Count off," he said quietly. "I need a count." The numbers came back worse than Sadao had feared. 23 dead or missing. 19 effective combatants. And the Germans were already moving to press their advantage, probing the American positions with scout patrols. "We can't hold here," someone said. "We need to fall back to the main line." "We fall back, and the entire offensive collapses," Wilson replied. "Division is counting on us to keep pressure on Jerry. If we retreat, they reinforce, and the whole mountain becomes impregnable." "So what do we do?" Sergeant Hayashi asked. "We're down to half strength. We've got wounded who can't walk. We've got no air support because of this damn weather, and Jerry knows exactly where we are." Wilson didn't answer immediately. He was looking at a map, though Sadao couldn't imagine what good a map would do. The terrain didn't match the intelligence reports. The German positions were far stronger than anticipated. And the 442nd, America's most decorated unit, fighting to prove their loyalty while their families rotted in camps, was bleeding out in a forgotten forest in France. The lieutenant's eyes swept across the exhausted faces of his men. They landed on Sadao, and for a moment, something flickered in Wilson's expression. Recognition, maybe. Or calculation. "Munmori," Wilson said quietly. "You made that shot." "The sniper." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Sadao replied. "How far?" 70 yards. Maybe 75. Wilson nodded slowly, still looking at him with that strange intensity. "You're a good shot." "I'm adequate, sir." "Don't be modest, soldier. I saw your qualifying scores. You're better than adequate." The lieutenant paused. "How do you feel about forward reconnaissance?" Sadao's stomach dropped. Forward reconnaissance. Moving ahead of the main body, identifying enemy positions, marking targets. It was specialized work, dangerous work, the kind of assignment usually reserved for scouts with years of experience. It was also a death sentence in terrain like this. But before Sadao could respond, the German mortars opened up again, and the question became irrelevant. The rally point turned into an inferno of explosions and shrapnel. Men screamed. The world became fire and noise and the overwhelming stench of cordite and blood. When the barrage finally lifted, Sadao found himself staring at the sky, his ears ringing, unsure if he'd been hit. He did a mental inventory, arms, legs, chest, all still attached, and slowly sat up. Lieutenant Wilson was dead. So was Sergeant Hayashi. The command structure of their improvised unit had been decapitated in 30 seconds. In the sudden, terrible silence that followed, someone had to make a decision. Someone had to take charge. The surviving soldiers, most of them wounded, all of them terrified, looked around desperately for leadership. Their eyes landed on Sadao Munmori. The skinny kid from Los Angeles they'd said was too weak for combat. The rain had become a constant companion, a cold presence that seeped through every layer of clothing and turned the Vosges Mountains into a landscape of perpetual misery. Sadao sat in what remained of their defensive position, methodically cleaning his rifle with a rag that was already filthy. Around him, 15 soldiers, the remnants of 4 different squads, waited for someone to tell them what to do next. He was not a leader. He'd never wanted to be a leader. Back at Camp Shelby during training, he'd been perfectly content to follow orders, do his job, and keep his head down. Leadership brought attention, and attention brought scrutiny, and scrutiny was dangerous for men who already had to work twice as hard to prove they weren't the enemy. But Lieutenant Wilson was dead. Sergeant Hayashi was dead. The chain of command had been obliterated, and someone needed to make decisions before the Germans decided to finish them off. Sadao looked at the faces watching him, Privates Nakamura, Oshiro, and Yamamoto, Corporal Sato with a field dressing wrapped around his head, PFC Martinez, one of the few non-Japanese soldiers attached to the unit, his left arm in a makeshift sling. They were scared. They were hurt. They needed someone to tell them they weren't going to die in this godforsaken forest. "We're not retreating," Sadao said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Several men stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "The hell we're not," Corporal Sato said. "Mune Mori, we're down to 15 effectives. We've got no officer, no comms with battalion, and Jerry's probably organizing another push right now. We need to fall back while we still can." "Fall back to where?" Sadao asked. "The Germans have infiltrators behind our lines. You saw those patrols. They've got us bracketed. We move, we get hit on the march when we can't defend ourselves. At least here we've got cover and firing positions. So we just sit here and wait to die?" "No." Sadao set down his rifle and pulled out Wilson's crumpled map. "We do what the lieutenant wanted. We apply pressure. We make Jerry think we're stronger than we are." "With 15 men?" "With 15 men who know how to shoot." Sadao pointed at the map. "Look. This elevation here, point 617, they called it in the briefing. The Germans have a forward observation post there. 3, maybe 4 soldiers with a radio. They're the ones calling in mortar strikes and directing their machine gun positions. We take that out, we blind them." Martinez leaned in, studying the map with his good arm. "That's half a click through contested territory. We'd have to move at night, in this weather, through ground we don't know." "The weather's our advantage," Sadao replied. "This fog and rain, Jerry can't see any better than we can. And at night, we're ghosts. Small unit, fast and quiet. We hit the observation post, we fall back before they can organize a response. And if we run into a German patrol? Then we make sure we see them first." It was an insane plan. Sadao knew it was insane. But sitting here waiting for the next mortar barrage was also insane. At least this version of insanity gave them a chance to affect the outcome. Nakamura spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Mune Mori, you really think we can do this?" Sadao met his eyes. "I think the only way we survive the next 24 hours is if we stop reacting and start making Jerry react to us. I think every hour that observation post operates, more Americans die. And I think..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think when our families hear about what we did here, they should hear that we fought like soldiers, not that we hid in a hole and got overrun." That landed. He saw it in their faces, the subtle shift from despair to something harder, more focused. These were men whose families were imprisoned. Men who'd volunteered to fight for a country that had labeled them potential traitors. Every action they took wasn't just about survival, it was about proving something that should never have needed proof. "Okay," Sato said finally. "I'm in. But you're leading this, Mune Mori. You come up with the plan, you're responsible for getting us back alive." The weight of those words settled on Sadao's shoulders like a physical thing. Understood. They moved out at 0200 hours, during the darkest part of the night when even the rain seemed to muffle itself. Sadao led the column, 6 men, the lightest and most mobile of their group. They'd left the others to hold the defensive position and maintain the appearance of a full squad. Moving through the forest at night was like navigating a nightmare. The darkness was absolute. Every step risked snapping a branch that would echo like a gunshot. The mud tried to pull boots off feet. And somewhere in that blackness, German soldiers were doing the same thing, moving through their territory, confident in their knowledge of the terrain. Sadao used a technique his father had taught him during camping trips to the Sierra Nevada, back before the war, before Executive Order 9066, before everything changed. Move with the wind. Use ambient sound to mask your passage. Trust your other senses when sight fails you. They covered ground slowly, painfully slowly. An hour passed. 2 hours. They were approaching point 617 when Sadao raised his fist, the signal to freeze. Voices. German voices, casual conversation, somewhere ahead and to the left. Sadao hand-signaled for the squad to take cover. They melted into the undergrowth, becoming part of the forest. The voices grew closer. 2 German soldiers materialized out of the darkness, walking a patrol route with the relaxed demeanor of men who'd done this 100 times before. They passed within 10 feet of where Sadao lay pressed against the wet earth. If either German had looked down, if they'd shined a flashlight, if one of Sadao's men had coughed or shifted position. But the patrol moved on, their voices fading back into the night. Sadao waited a full 5 minutes before signaling the advance to continue. His heart hammered against his ribs. That had been pure luck. They couldn't count on luck twice. Point 617 was a rocky outcrop that rose above the forest canopy, giving an unobstructed view of the entire valley. The German observation post was exactly where intelligence said it would be, a sandbagged position with a canvas shelter to keep the radio dry. 2 soldiers were visible, both bundled against the cold, one speaking into the radio handset while the other scanned the valley with binoculars. Sadao studied the position from 75 yards away, hidden in a thicket of pine. The Germans had built their OP well. One approached from the south, steep and exposed. Anyone trying to assault from that direction would be silhouetted against the sky. The other sides dropped off sharply into ravines. But they'd made one mistake, they'd assumed their front line was secure. They'd positioned both guards facing south, toward where they expected American troops to be. Their northern flank was completely exposed. Sadao gestured for Nakamura and Oshiro to circle around while he, Martinez, and Yamamoto provided covering positions. The maneuver took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of agonizing tension while Sadao watched those 2 German soldiers, waiting for them to turn, to see, to sound an alarm. They never did. When Nakamura and Oshiro were in position, Sadao gave the signal. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. 2 suppressed rifle shots. The Germans had provided those suppressors themselves by abandoning them at an earlier position. The radio operator went down first. His companion reached for his weapon and took Oshiro's round through the chest. The observation post fell silent. Sadao's team moved in quickly, securing the position. Martinez, who'd worked with communications before the war, immediately began examining the radio. "It's still transmitting," he whispered. They were in the middle of a relay to their artillery positions. "Can you use it?" Martinez grinned despite the pain in his injured arm. "Can I use it? Mune Mori, I can do better than use it. I can feed them false coordinates." And that's exactly what they did. For the next 40 minutes, Martinez posed as a German radio operator, his German fluent enough to pass over a crackling military radio. He relayed coordinates, German coordinates. Position markers for Wehrmacht trenches and machine gun nests. 3 minutes later, German artillery began shelling their own positions. The confusion was immediate and catastrophic. Sadao heard shouting from multiple directions, saw lights flickering through the forest as German soldiers scrambled to understand why their own guns were firing on them. In the chaos, the small American team slipped away like smoke, carrying the German radio equipment and every scrap of intelligence they could find. They made it back to their defensive position an hour before dawn. The men who'd stayed behind stared at them like they were ghosts. "Did you?" Corporal Soto couldn't finish the question. "We took out their OP," Sadao reported. "Fed them false coordinates. Jerry's artillery just spent 30 minutes hitting their own lines. They're going to be disorganized for hours trying to figure out what happened." Soto laughed, a slightly unhinged sound that spoke to how close they'd all been to breaking. "You magnificent crazy bastard. You actually did it." But Sadao wasn't celebrating. He was looking at the captured German documents Martinez had translated. Maps showing Wehrmacht positions. Strength reports. Supply routes. And one piece of intelligence that made his blood run cold. The Germans were planning a major counteroffensive, a push designed to encircle and destroy the entire 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They had 72 hours before it launched. And Sadao's tiny group of survivors were the only ones who knew it was coming. Dawn broke over the Vosges Mountains with the same dismal grey light that had become the only weather Sadao remembered. The captured German intelligence lay spread across a fallen log, held down by rocks to keep the wind from scattering it. Martinez sat beside it, still translating, his face growing more troubled with each page. "It's worse than we thought," Martinez said quietly. "According to these orders, the Wehrmacht has been pulling units from the Gothic line. Veterans from Italy. They're staging a 3-pronged assault, here, and here." He pointed at the map. They're going to hit the 442nd from 3 directions simultaneously, collapse the center, then roll up the flanks. The entire regiment will be cut off and destroyed. When? Sadao asked. October 24th, 0600 hours. Martinez checked his watch. That's in 64 hours. Corporal Soto leaned over the documents. We need to get this to Battalion HQ. They need to know Jerry's planning something this big. Our radio's been dead since the mortar attack, Nakamura pointed out. And we don't even know where Battalion HQ is anymore. For all we know, they've been pushed back 10 miles. So we send a runner, Soto said. Through terrain crawling with German patrols? That's a suicide mission. Everything's a suicide mission in this damn forest. Sadao held up a hand, cutting off the argument. His mind was racing, processing angles and possibilities. The captured documents weren't just intelligence about the German counteroffensive. They also showed the positions of Wehrmacht units right now, machine gun nests, mortar pits, supply depots, and, most importantly, the command bunker where the German officers were coordinating the entire Vosges defense. An idea was forming. A terrible, audacious idea. We don't need to reach Battalion, Sadao said slowly. We need to stop the counteroffensive from happening. Everyone stared at him. Mune Mori, Soto said carefully, there's 15 of us. The Germans have at least 2 companies in this sector, probably more. We can't stop a counteroffensive. Not directly. But look. Sadao spread out the map. The German command structure is centralized. They're running everything through this bunker here, about 3 clicks northeast. Officers, communications, the whole nerve center. If we take that out, the counteroffensive falls apart, Martinez finished. Units lose coordination. Orders don't get through. It buys the 442nd time to reposition. Exactly. It's also a hardened defensive position protected by at least a platoon of veteran Wehrmacht soldiers, Soto countered. We'd never get close. Unless they think we're not a threat, Sadao replied. Look at what we did last night. We moved through their territory, hit their observation post, and got out clean. They still don't know what happened. They think they're dealing with conventional American tactics, large units, heavy weapons, frontal assaults. They're not expecting what we can do. Which is? We can be ghosts. Over the next hour, Sadao laid out a plan that was equal parts brilliant and insane. They would split into 3 teams. Team 1, Nakamura, Oshiro, and Yamamoto, would create a diversion 2 clicks south of the German bunker, making it look like a major American push. Team 2, Martinez and 2 others, would use the captured German radio to feed false reports of American movements, pulling German reinforcements away from the bunker. And Team 3, Sadao, Soto, and 3 volunteers, would infiltrate the bunker itself and destroy it. You're talking about a deep penetration raid, Martinez said. Special operations level stuff. We're infantry, Mune Mori. We're not trained for this. No, Sadao agreed. But we're what we've got. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Sadao had them gather every scrap of German equipment they'd captured or scavenged, helmets, uniform pieces, weapon belts. Not enough for a full disguise, but in the dark and rain, it might buy them crucial seconds of confusion. They also made improvised explosives from grenades and German ammunition they'd found. Sadao had learned demolitions in basic training, though he'd never imagined actually using those skills. The devices they constructed were crude but effective, enough to collapse a bunker if placed correctly. As afternoon turned to evening, Sadao found himself checking and rechecking his equipment with nervous energy. He thought about his family, his mother and father, his younger sister Noriko, all of them locked behind barbed wire at the Gila River internment camp in Arizona. His mother's last letter had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through military channels. She'd written about the dust storms, about learning to make furniture from scrap wood, about Noriko's 13th birthday celebrated with a cake made from carefully hoarded ingredients. She'd asked, at the end, "Are you safe?" Sadao hadn't known how to answer that. How do you tell your mother that safety is a luxury soldiers don't have? That every morning you wake up is a small miracle? That you're fighting for a country that imprisoned her because of what her face looked like? Instead, he'd written back about the French countryside, about the food, about the camaraderie with his fellow soldiers. All true. All carefully edited to remove the parts about watching friends die, about the cold that never left your bones, about the fear that sat in your stomach like a stone. You thinking about home? Soto asked, appearing beside him. Sadao nodded. You? My wife. We got married 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Sato smiled sadly. Spent our honeymoon building crates at the assembly center. Real romantic. After the war. Don't, Sato interrupted gently. Don't talk about after the war. Not before a mission like this. It's bad luck. They moved out at 2,100 hours, under cover of full darkness. The teams split at a Y junction in the trail, each heading to their designated positions. Sadao's team, him, Sato, and Privates Tanaka Jr., Lee, and Williams, moved northeast, toward the German bunker. The journey took 3 hours of agonizing stealth. They bypassed 2 German patrols, once having to lie motionless in a freezing stream for 20 minutes while soldiers passed overhead on a bridge. The cold was unbearable. Sadao lost feeling in his fingers and toes. But they kept moving. At 0030 hours, they reached the ridge overlooking the German command bunker. It was larger than Sadao had expected, a reinforced concrete structure built into the hillside, with gun positions covering the approaches and a double sentry system at the entrance. Light spilled from ventilation slits, and they could hear the murmur of voices, the clatter of equipment. That's at least 30 men inside, Sato whispered. Maybe more. Sadao studied the position. The front was impregnable, he could see that immediately. But the bunker had been built into the hillside, which meant... there. He pointed to where a camouflaged chimney pipe emerged from the ground about 50 yards behind the main structure. Ventilation system. If we can get explosives into that pipe, the blast will channel through the bunker's air ducts. Would need to get past those sentries, Lee said. Not if they're looking the wrong direction. Sadao checked his watch. In 15 minutes, Nakamura's team launches their diversion. Every German eye is going to be facing south. That's when we move. The 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. Sadao lay in the wet undergrowth, rifle ready, counting seconds. Around him, his team waited with the tense stillness of coiled springs. Then, from the south, came the sound of explosions and gunfire. Nakamura's diversion had begun. The German sentries immediately turned toward the noise, shouting to each other. Inside the bunker, Sadao heard orders being barked, boots running. The defenders were responding exactly as predicted, mobilizing to counter what they thought was a major American attack. Now, Sadao breathed. They moved like shadows. Across open ground that felt naked and exposed. Toward that ventilation pipe jutting from the earth. Sato and Williams provided cover while Sadao, Lee, and Tanaka Jr. reached the pipe. Up close, Sadao could feel warm air flowing from inside, the bunker's heating system pulling cold air and expelling warmth. Perfect. He pulled out their improvised explosives, carefully rigged them together with wire and a 30-second fuse, and lowered the entire assembly into the pipe. Fall back, he whispered. They retreated to the tree line. Sadao watched the seconds tick away on his watch. 20. 15. 10. A German soldier emerged from the bunker entrance, still buckling his equipment belt, heading toward the ventilation area. He was going to see the fuse. 5 seconds, Sato hissed. He's going to see. The explosion cut off the rest. But it didn't sound right. Instead of the contained blast Sadao had expected, the detonation was massive, a rolling thunderclap that lifted the ground and sent a column of flame shooting through the ventilation pipe. Secondary explosions followed immediately. The bunker's ammunition stores, Sadao realized. Their small explosives had set off the Germans' own stockpiled ordnance. The entire hillside erupted. The bunker collapsed inward. Men screamed. The night turned orange with fire. Go! Sadao shouted. Move now before they organize. They ran. The forest behind them had become a scene of apocalyptic chaos. The German command bunker burned like a funeral pyre, ammunition cooking off in staccato bursts that sent tracer rounds careening wildly into the night sky. Sadao's team crashed through the undergrowth, abandoning stealth for speed, knowing that within minutes the entire Wehrmacht position would be swarming with soldiers trying to understand what had just happened. Behind them, voices shouted in German. Whistles blew. Flashlights swept the forest in chaotic patterns. The pursuit had begun. Split up. Sato gasped as they reached a fork in the trail. Rally at position Delta. They scattered. Sadao went left with Tanaka Jr., crashing through a thicket that tore at their uniforms and skin. Behind them, a burst of machine gun fire chewed up the forest, German ~42s firing blind into the darkness. The sound was distinctive, a buzzsaw roar that every American soldier learned to fear. 1,200 rounds per minute. Hitler's zipper, they called it. Sadao dove into a ravine, landing hard, sliding down a muddy slope until he fetched up against a fallen tree. Tanaka Jr. landed beside him a second later. They lay there, gasping, while the sounds of pursuit echoed above. Did we make it? Tanaka wheezed. Not yet. Move. Stay low. They crawled along the ravine bottom, using the depression for cover. Water ran through it, a small stream swollen by rain, and the icy flows soaked them to the bone. But it also masked their scent and muffled sound. They followed it for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, putting distance between themselves and the burning bunker. When they finally climbed out of the ravine, Sadao took a moment to orient himself. The rendezvous point, position Delta, was an old hunter's cabin marked on Wilson's map, about 2 clicks northeast. If they'd done everything right, all 3 teams would converge there before dawn. If any of them were still alive. They moved through the pre-dawn darkness, and with every step, Sadao felt the weight of what they'd done settling over him. They'd destroyed a German command center. They'd disrupted the counteroffensive. But they'd also kicked a hornet's nest, and now the hornets were swarming. Position Delta materialized out of the gloom, a collapsed wooden structure that barely qualified as shelter but provided enough cover to hide 15 men. Soto was already there, along with Williams and Lee. They looked like they'd been through hell, uniforms torn, faces scratched and bleeding. Where are the others? Sadao asked. Nakamura's team got hit during their withdrawal, Soto said grimly. Martinez's group? I don't know. Haven't seen them. 15 minutes passed. 20. Dawn was coming, and with it, the end of darkness's protection. They couldn't stay here much longer. Then, voices in the forest. German voices. The patrol appeared, 8 Wehrmacht soldiers moving in a standard sweep formation, rifles ready. They were tired, muddy, and angry, and they were walking directly toward the cabin. Sadao made rapid calculations. His group was outnumbered. They were exhausted. They had limited ammunition. A firefight here would be suicide. The gunfire would bring every German in the sector down on them. But if they tried to run, the patrol would see them and shoot them in the back. He met Soto's eyes and saw the same understanding there. They were out of options. This was where they'd make their stand. Sadao positioned his men in a rough perimeter inside the collapsed cabin, each soldier finding whatever cover they could. He took up position behind a section of collapsed wall, his rifle trained on the approaching Germans. Beside him, Tanaka Jr. was shaking, whether from cold or fear, Sadao couldn't tell. Steady, Sadao whispered. Wait for my shot. Make the first one count. The German patrol drew closer. 50 yards. 40. The leader was a sergeant, older than the others, scanning the forest with the paranoid intensity of a veteran who'd survived too long by never assuming anywhere was safe. 30 yards. The sergeant raised his hand, stopping his patrol. He'd seen something, maybe a boot print in the mud, maybe the disturbed undergrowth where Sadao's team had entered the cabin. His eyes narrowed. 20 yards. The sergeant's rifle came up, and in that split second, Sadao made the decision. He squeezed his trigger. The Garen's report shattered the morning quiet. The German sergeant went down. And suddenly the forest erupted with gunfire from both sides. Sadao worked his rifle with mechanical efficiency, sight picture, squeeze, sight picture, squeeze. The Germans were scrambling for cover, caught in the open, and for a few critical seconds, Sadao's team had the advantage. Another German fell. Then another. But the Wehrmacht soldiers were professionals. They returned fire with disciplined bursts, and Sadao heard someone scream behind him, Williams, hit in the leg. The odds were tilting. They were burning through ammunition too fast. And the noise would bring reinforcements. We can't hold here. Soto shouted over the gunfire. We need to. An explosion cut him off. The world went white. Sadao found himself on his back, ears ringing, staring at the sky. A German potato masher grenade had landed inside the cabin. By pure luck, it had detonated in a corner away from where most of his men were positioned, but the blast had still shredded the cabin's remaining structure. Sadao's vision cleared enough to see a German soldier rushing through the smoke, bayonet fixed. No time to think. He pulled his sidearm, a .45 pistol he'd barely trained with, and fired 3 times. The German crumpled. More Germans were coming. He could hear them shouting, coordinating. His team was down to maybe 5 effective shooters, pinned in a collapsed building with nowhere to run. This was it. This was how it ended. And then, from the south, came a sound that made Sadao's heart leap, the distinctive roar of American .30 caliber machine guns. Not one gun. Multiple guns. A whole platoon's worth of firepower, tearing through the forest. The German patrol trying to overrun the cabin suddenly had bigger problems. They turned to face this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, Sadao shouted, "On me! Break contact now!" His team bolted from the ruins, running north while the Germans were engaged to the south. Behind them, the firefight intensified. Whoever had come to their aid was hitting the Wehrmacht position hard. Sadao didn't know who it was, didn't have time to wonder. He just ran, pulling the wounded Williams along with Tanaka Jr.'s help. They covered 200 yards before the forest opened into a cleared area, and Sadao nearly wept with relief at what he saw: American soldiers. 2 full platoons of the 442 ND's 2nd Battalion, advancing in combat formation, with a captain at their head. "Friendlies!" Soto screamed. "Friendlies coming in!" The American line held fire. Sadao's team staggered into their perimeter, and only then did Sadao allow himself to collapse, his legs finally giving out. A medic appeared immediately, checking him over, but Sadao pushed him toward Williams. Him first. His hit. The captain, a tall man with a Minnesota accent and captain's bars, crouched beside Sadao. "Who the hell are you people? We've been trying to find survivors from the Western patrols for 2 days. Mune, sir. PFC, we've been operating independently." "Operating independently? Son, the whole sector thought you were dead. What have you been doing out here?" Sadao almost laughed. What had they been doing? Surviving. Fighting. Destroying German positions with a handful of men and pure desperation. "Sir, I have intelligence," Sadao said instead. "The Germans are planning a major counteroffensive. October 24th. But we destroyed their command bunker last night. Their coordination is broken. If you hit them now, while they're disorganized." The captain's eyes widened. "You destroyed? Private, are you telling me that explosion we saw last night was you?" "Yes, sir." "With how many men?" "Started with 15, sir. Down to 8 effectives now." The captain stared at him for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio. "Actual, this is Charlie 6. I found survivors from the lost patrol. You need to hear this. They have intelligence on German offensive operations, and they've already conducted successful raids on enemy positions. Request immediate tactical conference." The radio crackled back in affirmative. Around them, the sounds of battle were fading as the German patrol either retreated or was eliminated. Dawn had fully broken now, gray light filtering through the trees. Sadao sat with his back against a pine tree, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion. His hands were shaking. His body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. But they'd done it. Against impossible odds, with no support and minimal equipment, they disrupted German operations and survived. Martinez appeared, emerging from the forest with the remnants of his radio team. Then Nakamura, Oshiro, and Yamamoto, blooded but alive. One by one, Sadao's team straggled in. Out of 15 men who'd started this desperate gambit, 12 were still standing. "Mune," Nakamura said quietly. "We heard what happened at the bunker. Prisoners are saying the Germans lost their entire command staff. The colonel who was coordinating the counteroffensive is dead. Their communications network is completely disrupted." "How many?" Soto asked. "How many Germans did we take out?" Martinez had been counting on his fingers. "The observation post, 2. The bunker explosion, at least 40. The firefights during infiltration and extraction." He paused. "Mune, I think you personally accounted for about 30 kills. Maybe more." 30. The number hit Sadao like a physical blow. 30 human beings who'd woken up yesterday morning, written letters home, eaten breakfast, and died because he'd pulled a trigger or placed an explosive. 30 sons, brothers, fathers who'd never see Germany again. He'd been in combat for 10 days. They said he was too weak for this. Too small. Too soft. But in 10 days, operating behind enemy lines with minimal support, Sadao Mune and his improvised squad had killed or incapacitated approximately 90 German soldiers, destroyed key military infrastructure, and prevented a counteroffensive that would have annihilated the entire 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The captain was right, they'd thought his patrol was dead. Instead, that small group of dead men had changed the entire trajectory of the battle for the Vosges Mountains. 3 days later, Sadao Mune sat in a tent at battalion headquarters, wearing a clean uniform that felt foreign after so long in the field. Outside, the sounds of the camp were almost peaceful, the organized chaos of an army that wasn't actively dying, just preparing for the next operation. Colonel Miller, the battalion commander, studied him from across a field desk cluttered with maps and reports. The colonel was a West Point graduate who'd earned his command through combat effectiveness rather than politics, and he had the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many of his soldiers die. Private Munmori, the colonel said, I've been reading the after-action reports from your activities. Captain Harrison says you and 14 other soldiers operated behind German lines for 72 hours, conducted multiple raids, destroyed a major enemy command facility, and disrupted a planned counteroffensive. Is that accurate? Yes, sir. With no officer supervision. No communication with battalion. Operating entirely on your own initiative. Lieutenant Wilson gave me orders before he died, sir. I was just following through. Wilson's orders were to conduct reconnaissance. Not to launch a one-squad guerrilla campaign. The colonel paused. I should probably court-martial you for operating outside your authority. Sadow's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on surviving, on completing the mission, that he hadn't considered the military bureaucracy. Had he actually violated regulations by taking command? By conducting those raids without proper authorization? But Colonel Miller was smiling, a slight, tired smile, but genuine. Instead, I'm putting you in for a Silver Star. And a battlefield promotion to sergeant. The words didn't make sense for a moment. Sir, I don't understand. You disrupted German operations across an entire sector with a handful of men. You prevented a counteroffensive that intelligence confirms would have been catastrophic. You demonstrated initiative, tactical acumen, and leadership under impossible circumstances. The colonel leaned forward. Munmori, do you know what the German prisoners are saying? They think they were fighting against a full company of elite American commandos. They can't believe it was just 15 infantry soldiers. I had good men, sir. You had frightened, exhausted men who'd been left for dead. You turned them into an effective fighting force through pure leadership. That's not something you can teach. The tent flap opened, and Soto entered, followed by Martinez, Nakamura, and the others. They'd all been cleaned up, bandaged, given hot food and rest. They looked like different men from the muddy, blood-spattered ghosts who'd staggered out of the forest. Sir, Soto said, permission to speak. Granted. What Munmori did out there, it wasn't just tactics. He kept us alive when we should have died. He gave us a reason to keep fighting when it would have been easier to just give up. Every man here owes him our lives. I was just doing my job, Sadow protested. No, Martinez said quietly. You did everyone else's job too. You were the scout, the tactician, the leader, the guy who made the hard calls. And you never asked us to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. The colonel nodded. The 442nd has a reputation as the most decorated unit in the army. Men like you are why. Men who fight not just for their country, but for each other. Who prove every day that loyalty isn't about where your parents were born or what your face looks like, it's about what you do when everything is on the line. That night, Sadow wrote a letter home. It was harder than any combat mission. Dear Mother and Father. I'm safe. I know I always say that, but this time I mean it more than usual. We had a difficult few weeks, but it's over now. The other soldiers are calling us heroes, which feels strange. I don't feel like a hero. I just did what needed to be done. I think about you every day. About Noriko. About home. Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting for a country that doesn't want us, that locked you away because of how we look. But then I think about the men I've served with, Soto, Martinez, Nakamura, all of them. We're from different places, different backgrounds. But out here, none of that matters. Out here, we're just soldiers trying to keep each other alive. Maybe that's what I'm really fighting for. Not America as it is, but America as it should be. A place where we're judged by what we do, not where we came from. I hope this war ends soon. I hope I get to come home and see you again. Until then, know that I'm okay. And I'm making a difference. With love, Sadow. He didn't tell them about the 90 German soldiers. Didn't tell them about the nights he still woke up seeing faces of men he'd killed. Didn't tell them that the nightmares probably wouldn't ever stop. Some things soldiers carried alone. The Vosges campaign continued for another 3 weeks. The 442nd broke through the German defenses, opening the path for the Allied advance into Germany. The counteroffensive that Sadow's intelligence had warned about never materialized. The Wehrmacht's command structure in the sector was too disrupted, too disorganized to mount the coordinated assault they'd planned. Historians would later estimate that Saddam Munmori's actions potentially saved hundreds of American lives by preventing that counteroffensive. The congressional record would note his extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty. The Japanese-American community would celebrate him as proof of their loyalty and courage. But Saddam never thought of himself as special. He was just a soldier who'd done his job. A skinny kid from Los Angeles who'd been told he was too weak for combat, who'd responded by becoming one of the most effective warriors the 442nd Regimental Combat Team ever produced. On March 5, 1945, near Seravezza, Italy, Private First Class Saddam Munmori would perform one final act of heroism. When a German grenade landed near his squad, he threw himself on it, absorbing the blast with his own body. He died saving 2 of his men. For that action, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Japanese American to receive the nation's highest military decoration during World War II. But that was still months away. For now, in October 1944, he sat in a camp in the Vosges Mountains, cleaning his rifle and writing letters home, just another soldier in an army fighting to free the world. The men who'd said he was too weak for combat never apologized. They didn't need to. Saddam Munmori had already proven everything that needed proving. Not with words. With actions. In 10 days behind enemy lines, with nothing but courage, tactical brilliance, and an unbreakable will to survive, he'd shown that strength isn't measured in inches or pounds. It's measured in heart. In determination. In the willingness to stand up when everyone else says you should stay down. They said he was too weak for combat. They were wrong. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video.